Broken iron oath. Clara Monroe had spent years building a life of law and order, determined to prove she didn't need a man. But when Gideon Tate, a wanted man with a past tied to hers, ended up in her jail cell, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned against the bars, his voice smooth as whiskey. "You gonna pretend you don't remember, sweetheart?" he murmured. "Or, you gonna let me remind you?" Chapter 1. Dust and the Badge. The sun beat down on Redemption, Arizona, with the relentless fury only a desert July could muster. Clara Monroe squinted, her eyes, the color of faded denim, tracing the familiar line of the dusty main street. Buildings, weathered and worn, stood like tired sentinels against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Each creak of the wooden sidewalks, each distant whinny of a horse, was a note in the town's weary symphony. Clara adjusted the worn leather belt around her waist, the weight of the Colt Peacemaker a familiar comfort against her hip. The silver star pinned to her chest, a sheriff's badge, felt heavier than usual today. She'd earned that badge, every ounce of its weight. Proved herself in a world that believed a woman's place was anywhere but in a lawman's boots. 5 years she'd been sheriff of Redemption, 5 years of holding back the tide of lawlessness that threatened to engulf the small, struggling town. 5 years of proving she didn't need a man to define her, to protect her, to complete her. She'd buried that need deep, along with the memories of a girl she used to be, a girl who believed in fairy tales and happily ever afters. A gust of wind whipped down the street, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and something else, something acrid and unsettling. Trouble. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the butt of her Colt. She pushed open the door to the sheriff's office, the small bell above jingling a discordant welcome. The room was dim, the only light filtering through the dusty windows and the single oil lamp flickering on her desk. Martha, her dispatcher and the closest thing Clara had to a friend in Redemption, looked up from her paperwork. Martha, a woman built like a sturdy oak, with a voice that could soothe a wildcat and a gaze that could wither a cactus, was the heart of the office. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, her voice a low rumble. "Got a visitor for you." Clara's eyes followed Martha's nod towards the single jail cell at the back of the room. A figure sat on the narrow cot, shrouded in shadow. Tall, even-seated, with a broad-shouldered silhouette that hinted at coiled strength. He was leaning back against the rough stone wall, one leg stretched out, an ankle crossed over the other knee in a posture of almost insolent ease. He was a study in contrasts, dark hair, almost black, tumbling over a forehead that suggested stubbornness, and eyes that Clara couldn't quite make out in the gloom. "Brought in by a couple of Johnson's boys," Martha continued, her voice laced with a hint of something Clara couldn't quite place. "Curiosity? Concern? Claim he was trespassing on their land, causing a ruckus. Said his name was Tate. Gideon Tate." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. A jolt of something cold and sharp pierced the carefully constructed armor around her heart. Gideon Tate. A name from a past she'd tried to bury, a past that was now sitting in her jail cell, looking like a storm about to break. She hadn't heard that name in over 10 years, not since. She pushed the thought away, her jaw tightening. "He say anything?" Clara asked, her voice deliberately neutral, betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. Martha shook her head. "Not a word. Just stared at those boys. Scared him half to death, I reckon. He didn't resist when they brought him in." Clara took a deep breath, the scent of old wood and stale coffee filling her lungs. She walked towards the cell, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. As she drew closer, the shadows receded, revealing the man within. His eyes, now visible, were the color of a stormy sky, intense and unsettling. They held a flicker of something recognition? Amusement? It was hard to tell. He had a strong jaw, dusted with a few days' worth of stubble, and a mouth that looked like it could be both cruel and kind. A scar, thin and white, traced a path across his left cheekbone, a silent testament to a life lived on the edge. He unfolded himself from the cot, rising to his full height. He was even taller than she'd imagined, towering over her. He leaned against the bars, his arms crossed, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, Clara, he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a voice she hadn't forgotten, a voice that had once whispered promises in the darkness. Long time no see. She stared at him, her mind reeling. The boy she remembered, the reckless, charming boy with the wild eyes and the easy laugh, was gone. In his place stood this man, hardened, dangerous, a stranger wearing a familiar face. But the eyes were the same. Tate, she said, her voice flat, her hand resting on her gun. You're trespassing and disturbing the peace. You're under arrest. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another wave of unease through her. Is that any way to greet an old friend, sweetheart? The endearment, spoken with such casual familiarity, grated on her nerves. It was a deliberate provocation, a reminder of a time when she'd been someone else, someone vulnerable. Someone who had believed his lies. We're not friends, Tate, she said, her voice cold. And you're in my jail. That makes you my prisoner. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of challenge in his stormy eyes. You gonna pretend you don't remember, sweetheart? He murmured, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the sound sending a shiver down her spine, despite her best efforts to remain impassive. Or, you gonna let me remind you? His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The memories, the ones she'd fought so hard to suppress, threatened to surface. The scent of sagebrush and campfire smoke, the feel of his hand in hers, the whispered promises under a vast, star-studded sky, all of it came rushing back, threatening to drown her. She clenched her fist, her nails digging into her palm. She wouldn't let him see her weakness. She wouldn't let him see that he still had the power to unsettle her. She had to get a hold of herself before he took advantage of her vulnerability, of the ghost of the girl that had once fallen so hard. She took another step, her eyes locking with his, defying the unspoken challenge in his intense gaze. The only thing I remember, Tate, is that you're a wanted man. And you're going to stay in that cell until I decide what to do with you. She had to remain strong, to show him that she was no longer that naive girl. She had to protect herself, to protect the town, to protect the image of strength she held so dear. But deep down, she was not sure she wanted to. What was he doing here after all this time? Chapter 2. The Prisoner's Eyes. Clara turned away from the cell, her back stiff, her shoulders tight. The silence that followed Gideon's words felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her like the weight of the desert sky. She needed to put some distance between herself and him, between herself and the memories he stirred. Martha, she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended, get me the wanted posters. All of them. And anything else we have on a Gideon, Tate. Martha, ever perceptive, gave her a knowing look but didn't comment. She simply nodded and moved to the overflowing file cabinet in the corner, its drawers stuffed with years of accumulated paperwork, the detritus of a town struggling to maintain order. Clara walked to her desk, the scarred wooden surface littered with reports, letters, and the ever-present layer of dust that seemed to permeate everything in redemption. She sat down heavily, the chair creaking in protest. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the throbbing that had started behind her eyes. Gideon Tate. Why now? Why here? After all these years, after she'd finally built a life for herself, a life free from the shadow of her past, he had walked back into it, as casually as if he'd just stepped out for a breath of fresh air. She remembered the day she'd left, the dust swirling around her as she rode away from the only home she'd ever known. The pain, the betrayal, the bitter taste of shattered dreams, it had all been fuel for the fire that had forged her into the woman she was now. A woman who needed no one. A woman who trusted no one. The rustle of paper brought her back to the present. Martha placed a thick stack of wanted posters on her desk, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. The top one featured a crudely drawn sketch of a man with dark hair and sharp eyes. It could have been anyone, but the name beneath it was unmistakable. Gideon Tate. Wanted for robbery, cattle rustling, and assault. Clara flipped through the posters, each one adding another layer to the picture of the man in her jail cell. He was a ghost, a shadow, flitting through the territories, always one step ahead of the law. The descriptions varied, some portraying him as a ruthless outlaw, others as a charming rogue. But one thing remained constant. He was dangerous. She found a few older reports, handwritten accounts of his alleged crimes. They painted a picture of a man who lived by his own rules, a man who took what he wanted and damned the consequences. A man who was nothing like the boy she remembered. Or was he? A nagging doubt crept into her mind. She remembered the Gideon she knew, the boy with the quick smile and the rebellious streak. He'd been wild, yes, but there had been something else there too, a vulnerability, a hint of sadness that he tried to hide. Had that boy been completely swallowed up by the harsh realities of the frontier? Or was there still a flicker of him somewhere beneath the hardened exterior? She glanced back at the cell. Gideon was watching her, his eyes unreadable. He was leaning against the bars again, his posture relaxed, but she sensed a coiled tension in him, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Find anything interesting, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate through the room. Clara ignored him, focusing on the reports. There was one detail that caught her eye, a recurring mention of a silver locket shaped like a hawk in flight. He was said to always wear it, a memento of someone or something. A lost love? A family heirloom? A symbol of his past? She remembered a silver locket. She remembered him giving it to her, the day before she cut the memory short, refusing to let it take hold. "Martha," she said, her voice steadier now. "Did you search him?" "Of course, Sheriff," Martha replied. "Found a Colt, a knife, some cash, and this." Martha held out her hand. In her palm lay a silver locket, shaped like a hawk in flight. Its surface was tarnished, but the intricate detail was still visible. It was the same locket. Clara reached out and took it, her fingers tracing the outline of the hawk. It felt cold and heavy in her hand, a tangible link to a past she'd tried to erase. She opened it, revealing two tiny, faded portraits. One was of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, a woman she vaguely recognized. The other was of her. She snapped the locket shut, her heart pounding. The sight of her own younger, more innocent face, staring back at her from the past, was a shock. It was a reminder of everything she'd lost, everything she'd buried. "He said anything about this?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Martha shook her head. "Not a word. Just looked at me with those eyes." Clara knew exactly what Martha meant. Gideon's eyes, those stormy, unsettling eyes, held a depth of emotion that was both captivating and frightening. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, felt too much, lost too much. They were the eyes that had haunted her dreams for years. He was dangerous, she knew that. He was a wanted man, an outlaw, a threat to everything she'd worked for. But he was also Gideon, the boy she'd once loved, the boy she'd thought she knew. The conflict tore at her, the sheriff battling the girl, the law warring with the memory of a love that had burned so brightly, so briefly, before being extinguished by the harsh winds of betrayal. She looked at him, standing there in the dim light of the cell, his eyes fixed on her, and she knew she was in trouble. Deep trouble. She had a decision to make, a decision that could change everything. The prisoner's eyes held a secret, one she wasn't sure she should uncover. But she had to. She had to know why he was here. She had to know if the boy she had loved was truly gone. And, most frighteningly, what the answer would do to her. The locket felt heavy, a dead weight in her hand. She had a feeling that her life was about to get far more complicated. Chapter 3. Echoes of a Shared Past. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sheriff's office, turning the dust motes dancing in the air into shimmering gold. Clara sat at her desk, the stack of wanted posters and reports spread out before her, a silent testament to Gideon Tate's life on the run. But her gaze kept drifting back to the cell, to the man who held a piece of her past captive within those stormy eyes. She'd sent Martha home for the day, the older woman's concerned glances lingering in Clara's mind. Martha knew something was amiss. She could sense the tension that crackled between Clara and the prisoner. But Clara couldn't explain, not yet. She wasn't ready to confront the ghosts that Gideon had stirred up, the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. The silence in the office was broken only by the occasional creak of the building and the rhythmic ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a reminder of the passage of time, of the years that had separated her from Gideon, from the life she'd left behind. She finally pushed herself up from the chair, her legs stiff from sitting for so long. She walked towards the cell, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. Gideon watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He was sitting on the cot again, his long legs stretched out, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a man who had all the time in the world, a man who was used to waiting. "You going to stare at me all day, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice a low drawl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Or are you going to tell me what you plan to do with me?" Clara stopped in front of the cell, her hand resting on the cold iron bars. "I'm still deciding," she said, her voice deliberately neutral. "You've got quite a record, Tate. Robbery, cattle rustling, assault. You've been a busy man." He shrugged, a careless gesture that belied the tension she sensed in him. "A man's got to make a living," he said. "Out here, it's survival of the fittest." "That's no excuse for breaking the law," Clara countered, her voice hardening. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "The law," he said, his voice laced with a hint of bitterness. "Whose law? The law of the rich landowners who steal from the poor? The law of the corrupt officials who line their pockets with bribes? That law?" Clara felt a flicker of something understanding. It was a dangerous feeling, a feeling she couldn't afford to indulge. She was the law in redemption, and she had to uphold it, regardless of her personal feelings. "The law is the law, Tate," she said, her voice firm. "And you've broken it. Repeatedly." He leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "And you, Clara?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Have you always followed the law? Every single rule?" The question caught her off guard. It was a challenge, a reminder of the secrets she kept hidden, the compromises she'd made. She'd always walked a fine line, balancing her duty with her own sense of justice. "I do what I have to do," she said, her voice evasive. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a wave of unease through her. "We all do what we have to do," he said. "That's what I remember about you, Clara. You were always resourceful." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He was referring to their past, to the time when they'd both lived outside the law, when they'd relied on each other to survive. Clara felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She couldn't deny it. She had been resourceful. She'd had to be. Growing up on the frontier, with a father who was more often drunk than sober and a mother who had died too young, she'd learned to fend for herself. She'd learned to hunt, to ride, to shoot and to steal. It was a part of her past she'd tried to forget, a part of her she'd buried deep. But Gideon remembered. He remembered everything. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice tight. "I'm not that girl anymore." "Aren't you?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "I see a flicker of her, Clara. In your eyes, in the way you hold yourself, she's still there." His words were like a key, unlocking a door she'd kept firmly closed for years. The memories flooded back, overwhelming her with their intensity. She remembered the thrill of riding under the moonlight, the danger, the freedom. She remembered the feel of Gideon's hand in hers, the warmth of his body next to hers, the whispered promises they'd made to each other. She remembered the betrayal. The memory hit her like a physical blow, the pain as sharp and raw as if it had happened yesterday. She'd trusted him, she'd loved him, and he'd left her. Without a word, without an explanation. He'd simply vanished, leaving her with a broken heart and a shattered dream. "You left," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words choked with emotion. "You just left." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I had my reasons," he said, his voice rough. "Reasons?" Clara scoffed, her anger rising. "What reasons could possibly justify leaving me like that? Leaving us like that?" He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain she hadn't expected. "It was complicated, Clara," he said. "More complicated than you know." "Then explain it to me," she demanded, her voice rising. "Tell me why you did it. Tell me why you broke my heart." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret? Remorse? It was hard to tell. "I can't," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." His refusal fueled her anger. "Why not?" she demanded. "What are you hiding, Tate? What secrets are you keeping?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Some secrets are best left buried, Clara," he said. "For everyone's sake." His words made her shiver, even in the growing twilight. Was he protecting her? Or was he just protecting himself? She didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than whatever he might be keeping from her. She had to know. She wouldn't rest until he had told her everything. But how to pry the words from him, a man hardened by the frontier and a life on the run? She stared into his eyes, searching for some sign, any sign, that he wasn't lying. Chapter 4. The Price of Honor. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, with accusations and regrets. Clara felt the weight of the past pressing down on her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to rage at him, to demand answers. But she knew it wouldn't do any good. Gideon Tate was a master of secrets, a man who held his cards close to his chest. She turned away from the cell, her back to him, her hands clenched into fists. She needed to think, to regain control. She was the sheriff, damn it, and he was her prisoner. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. "You'll stay in that cell until morning," she said, her voice cold and detached. "Then I'll decide what to do with you." She walked back to her desk, the wanted posters still spread out before her. She picked one up, the crudely drawn image of Gideon staring back at her. He looked younger in the drawing, less hardened, but the eyes were the same intense, unsettling, full of secrets. She crumpled the poster in her hand, her frustration boiling over. She was tired of the secrets, tired of the lies, tired of the constant struggle to maintain order in a town that seemed determined to tear itself apart. A noise from the cell made her turn. Gideon was standing at the bars, watching her. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "What?" she snapped, her voice sharp. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes searching hers. "You've changed, Clara," he said, his voice soft. "You've become harder." The observation stung, partly because it was true. She had become harder. She'd had to. The frontier demanded it. But she didn't want him to see that, to see the cracks in her armor. "I've grown up," she said, her voice defiant. "I'm not the naive girl you left behind." He smiled, a sad, wistful smile that tugged at something deep inside her. "No, you're not," he said. "But you're still you." His words were like a caress, a gentle touch that sent a shiver through her. She hated him for it, for his ability to get under her skin, to make her feel things she didn't want to feel. She turned away from him again, her gaze falling on the silver locket lying on her desk. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the outline of the hawk. It was a reminder of a time when things had been simpler, when she believed in love, in forever. She opened the locket, her eyes drawn to the tiny portraits inside. Her own younger face stared back at her, a ghost of the girl she used to be. The other portrait, the woman with the dark hair and kind eyes, was familiar, but she couldn't quite place her. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze still fixed on the locket. Gideon didn't answer immediately. She could hear him moving in the cell, the creak of the cot, the soft rustle of his clothes. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice low and rough. "She was my sister." Clara's head snapped up. His sister? She'd never known he had a sister. He'd never mentioned her. "I didn't know you had a sister," she said, her voice filled with surprise. He was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "There are a lot of things you don't know about me, Clara," he said. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She knew he was right. There was a whole world of secrets hidden behind those stormy eyes, a world she was only beginning to glimpse. What happened to her? She asked, her voice softer now, her curiosity overcoming her anger. He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that was raw and unmasked. She died, he said, his voice flat. A fever. Took her quick. Clara felt a pang of sympathy for him. She knew what it was like to lose someone, to feel the pain of their absence like a gaping wound in your soul. I'm sorry, she said, her voice sincere. He nodded, his gaze still fixed on hers. It was a long time ago, he said, but I still miss her. The vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, a crack in the hardened facade he presented to the world. It made her see him in a different light, not just as an outlaw, but as a man who had suffered, who had loved, who had lost. It was a dangerous realization, a realization that threatened to blur the lines between her duty and her emotions. She was the sheriff, and he was her prisoner. She couldn't afford to feel sympathy for him, to see him as anything other than a criminal. But she did. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weariness in his posture, the hint of sadness that lingered around him like a shadow. She saw the boy she'd once loved, the boy who had been buried beneath layers of hardship and betrayal. And she knew she was in deeper trouble than she'd ever imagined. She needed to uphold the law. But which law? The one on the books or the older, more primal law of the heart? His sister's death, was that connected to why he had left? She felt a stirring of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But hope, she knew, could be the most dangerous thing of all on the frontier. Especially when it came to a man like Gideon Tate. And the price of honor was steep, indeed. Chapter 5. Moonlit Confessions. The night settled over redemption like a thick blanket, muffling the sounds of the day and replacing them with the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Clara had lit a single lantern in the office, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She sat at her desk, the silver locket clutched in her hand, her mind racing. She'd tried to work, to focus on the paperwork that always seemed to accumulate, but her thoughts kept returning to Gideon, to the conversation they'd had, to the glimpse of vulnerability she'd seen in his eyes. She'd sent for some food from the saloon earlier, a plate of beans and biscuits for Gideon, a cup of coffee for herself. He'd eaten in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor, his expression unreadable. She tried to ignore him, to pretend he wasn't there, but it was impossible. His presence filled the small office, a constant reminder of the past, of the choices she'd made, of the life she'd left behind. After he'd finished eating, she'd cleared the plate and refilled his water cup. He'd thanked her, his voice low and rough, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment before darting away. Now, hours later, the silence had returned, thick and heavy. Clara couldn't stand it anymore. She needed to talk to him, to understand him, to find out why he was here. She pushed herself up from the chair, her legs stiff from sitting. She walked towards the cell, the lantern light illuminating his face. He was sitting on the cot, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. He looked peaceful, almost. A stark contrast to the dangerous outlaw she'd seen earlier. Tate, she said, her voice soft. His eyes opened, their stormy depths reflecting the lantern light. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Can't sleep? He asked, his voice a low murmur. Clara shook her head. Too much on my mind, she said. He nodded, understanding. This town, it weighs on you, doesn't it? The question surprised her. She hadn't expected him to be so perceptive, to understand the burden she carried. It's my responsibility, she said, her voice defensive. I swore an oath. An oath, he repeated, his voice laced with a hint of cynicism. And what has that oath cost you, Clara? The question hit her hard, forcing her to confront the sacrifices she'd made. She'd given up everything for this town, for this badge. She'd sacrificed her happiness, her dreams, her chance at love. It's cost me everything, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. And was it worth it? He asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. The lantern light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. You said you had your reasons, Clara said, her voice breaking the silence. For leaving. You said it was complicated. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor.
It was, he said.
More complicated than you can imagine. Tell me, she urged, her voice pleading. I need to understand. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear? Uncertainty? It was hard to tell. My sister Sarah, he began, his voice rough. She wasn't just sick. She was murdered. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Murdered? She whispered. By who? He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that was raw and unmasked. By the same men who own half this town, he said. The Johnsons. The Johnsons. The name sent a chill down Clara's spine. They were the most powerful family in Redemption, wealthy landowners who controlled everything from the bank to the saloon. They were untouchable.
Why?
Clara asked, her voice trembling. Why would they kill your sister? Gideon's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. She knew something, he said. Something they didn't want anyone to know. Something about their business dealings. Clara's mind raced. The Johnsons were known for their ruthlessness, for their willingness to do whatever it took to protect their interests.
But murder?
It seemed impossible. What did she know? Clara asked, her voice urgent. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as if he were afraid of being overheard. They were cheating the homesteaders, he said, his voice low. Stealing their land, their water, rights, everything. Sarah found proof. She was going to go to the authorities. And they killed her to silence her, Clara finished, her voice filled with horror. He nodded, his eyes filled with a bitter rage. They made it look like an accident, he said. A fever. But I knew the truth. And that's why you left, Clara said, her voice understanding now. You were going after them. He nodded again. I tried, he said. But they were too powerful. I had to disappear. I had to find another way. Another way? Clara asked, her voice confused. What other way? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate hope. You, Clara, he said. You're the sheriff. You can bring them to justice. His words were like a punch to the gut. He was asking her to betray everything she believed in, to go against the most powerful family in town, to risk her life, her career, everything. I can't, she said, her voice shaking. They're too powerful. They control everything. The moon illuminated his hardened features, and she saw something there she hadn't dared to hope for. A glimpse of the boy she'd once loved, the boy with honor, the boy that was worth fighting for. But taking on the Johnsons? That was suicide. And yet, Sarah's murder, his reason for leaving. It all made sense now. A horrible, twisted kind of sense. She saw the desperation in his eyes, a mirror of her own long-buried longing. She couldn't refuse him. Not this time. Not after everything. I need proof, she said, her voice trembling, but resolute. Something concrete. Something I can use. Chapter 6. A storm on the horizon. Gideon's eyes held a flicker of hope, a spark in the stormy depths. There is proof, he said, his voice low and urgent. A ledger. Sarah kept a detailed record of their dealings, the names, the dates, the amounts, everything. Clara's heart pounded. A ledger. That was exactly what she needed. Something tangible, something undeniable. Something she could use to bring the Johnsons down. Where is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze darting around the room, as if he were still afraid of being overheard, even within the confines of the jail. It's hidden, he said. In a place only I know. I was on my way to retrieve it when I was arrested. Clara's mind raced. He'd been heading for the Johnson ranch. That's why he'd been trespassing. He'd been so close. We need to get it, she said, her voice firm. Before they find it. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. I know, he said. But how? I'm locked in here. And you can't just ride out there. They'll be watching. He was right. The Johnsons were always vigilant, always suspicious. They had eyes and ears everywhere. If she just rode out there, they'd know something was up. They'd stop her. Or worse. She paced the small space in front of the cell, her mind working furiously. She needed a plan, a way to get to the ledger without raising suspicion. "I have an idea," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But it's risky." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of challenge in his eyes. "Risky is my middle name, Sheriff," he said. She ignored the jibe, her mind focused on the plan taking shape. "There's a cattle drive heading out tomorrow," she said. "A few of the smaller ranchers are pooling their herds, heading north to the railhead. I could join them." He looked at her, his expression skeptical. "You? A sheriff, joining a cattle drive? That'll raise eyebrows." "Not if I'm undercover," she said. "I can say I'm investigating cattle rustling. It's a common enough problem. It'll give me an excuse to be in the area." He considered her words, his eyes narrowed in thought.
"It might work," he said.
"But it's still dangerous. The Johnsons have men on those drives. They'll be watching you." "I can handle myself," she said, her voice confident. She'd faced down outlaws, bandits, and worse. She could handle a few cowboys. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I know you can, Clara," he said. "That's what I'm counting on." His words were a reminder of the trust he was placing in her, the risk he was taking. He was putting his life, his freedom, in her hands.
"I'll need your help," she said.
"You need to tell me exactly where the ledger is hidden.
"And you need to stay put."
Don't draw any attention to yourself." He nodded, his eyes serious. "I will," he said. "I promise." They spent the next few hours going over the plan, discussing every detail, every contingency. Gideon described the location of the ledger, a hidden compartment in an old abandoned cabin on the edge of the Johnson property. He drew her a map, a rough sketch on a scrap of paper, marking the landmarks, the trails, the dangers. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, they finished their preparations. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement. She was taking a huge risk, a gamble that could cost her everything. But she had to do it. For Gideon, for Sarah, for the chance to finally bring the Johnsons to justice. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the rising sun. He looked tired, but determined. A flicker of the boy she'd once loved shone through the hardened exterior. "Be careful, Clara," he said, his voice low and earnest.
"Please."
She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I will," she said. "I promise." She turned to leave, to gather her things, to prepare for the journey ahead. But before she could take a step, he spoke again. "Clara," he said, his voice hesitant. "There's something else. Something you should know." She turned back to him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "The Johnsons, they weren't just stealing land," he said. "They were involved in something else. Something bigger." Clara's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?"
she asked.
He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a darkness she hadn't seen before. "They were working with a gang of outlaws," he said. "A ruthless bunch, led by a man named Silas Blackwood." The name sent a chill down Clara's spine. Silas Blackwood was a legend, a phantom, a name whispered in hushed tones around campfires. He was said to be the most dangerous outlaw in the territory, a man with a reputation for cruelty and violence. "What kind of work?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The air felt charged, electric. A storm. Not just the metaphorical one, but a real one, brewing on the horizon. The sky outside had darkened considerably, mirroring her mood. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder, a premonition of the dangers to come. Gideon looked at her, his face grim, outlined against the increasingly violent weather outside. "They were running guns, Clara," he said, "selling them to anyone who could pay. And those guns, they weren't just going to small-time crooks." He paused and took a deep breath. He looked old, ancient, like the desert itself. "They were selling them to renegade tribes, Clara. Stirring up trouble, profiting from the chaos." He paused, locking eyes with her, ensuring the gravity of his words struck home. Starting a war. Chapter 7. The Outlaw's Bargain. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow.
Guns.
Renegade tribes.
Va.
It was worse than she'd ever imagined. The Johnsons weren't just greedy landowners, they were traitors, warmongers, responsible for countless deaths and untold suffering. The distant rumble of thunder grew louder, closer, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. The storm was breaking, both outside and within. I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. Why would they do that? What could they possibly gain? Gideon's eyes were filled with a bitter cynicism. Profit, Clara, he said. War is profitable. It creates demand for weapons, for supplies, for land. The Johnsons were lining their pockets while innocent people died. Clara felt a surge of rage, a burning anger that consumed her. She'd always known the Johnsons were corrupt, but this was beyond anything she could have comprehended. We have to stop them, she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We have to expose them, bring them to justice. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. I know, he said, but it won't be easy. Blackwood is dangerous, ruthless. He has men everywhere. And the Johnsons, they'll protect their operation at any cost. He was right.
It was a suicide mission.
But she couldn't back down.
Not now.
Not after everything she'd learned. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice defiant, though a tremor of fear ran through her. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. I know you're not, Clara, he said. That's why I'm trusting you with this. He reached through the bars, his hand covering hers. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a reminder of the connection they shared, the bond that had survived years of separation and betrayal. I need you to promise me something, he said, his voice low and earnest. If anything happens to me, you'll keep fighting. You'll expose them, no matter what. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I promise, she said. I won't let them get away with this. The storm outside reached its peak, the wind howling, the rain lashing against the windows. The sheriff's office was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the flickering lantern. I need to go, she said, her voice urgent. I need to join that cattle drive before it's too late. He released her hand, his eyes searching hers. Be careful, Clara, he said. Please. She nodded, her heart pounding. She turned to leave, to face the storm, both literal and figurative. But before she could reach the door, a voice stopped her. Sheriff. It was Martha, her voice filled with alarm. She burst into the office, her clothes soaked, her hair plastered to her face. Sheriff, she repeated, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There's trouble. A rider just came in from the Johnson ranch. Clara's heart sank. This was it. The Johnsons knew. What is it? Clara asked, her voice calm, despite the fear churning inside her. They say there's been an attack, Martha stammered. Renegade Indians. They hit one of the outlying homesteads. People are dead. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. It was happening. The war had begun, and she was caught in the middle. They're demanding to see you, Sheriff, Martha continued. They say they have a message. From Silas Blackwood. Clara's blood ran cold. Blackwood. He was making his move. He was using the attack to draw her out, to force her hand. She looked back at Gideon, his face pale in the dim light. He knew what this meant. It was a trap. Tell them I'll meet them, Clara said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. At the old abandoned church. At sunset. Martha looked at her, her eyes wide with fear. Sheriff, are you sure? She asked. It's dangerous. I know, Clara said. But I have no choice. She knew she was walking into a trap. But she also knew that she couldn't run. She wouldn't. She had a promise to keep, a debt to repay. And more than that, she had a town to protect. She glanced back at Gideon, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew the risks, and so did she. This could be the end. For both of them. But as she stepped out into the storm, she held her head high, the weight of the badge heavy on her chest. It was time to make a bargain with the devil himself. And she was prepared to pay the price. Whatever that might be. The rain was cold, stinging her skin. But she didn't flinch. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Saloon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cleansed world, the air fresh and crisp, the scent of wet earth and sagebrush filling Clara's nostrils. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to the grim task ahead. Clara rode slowly through the town, her horse's hooves splashing through the puddles left by the rain. The streets were mostly deserted, the townsfolk huddled inside their homes, fear and uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. The news of the attack had spread like wildfire, fueling the already simmering tensions. She reached the old abandoned church, a weathered wooden structure that stood on a small hill overlooking the town. It was a relic of redemption's early days, a testament to a time when hope and faith had been stronger than fear and despair. Now it was a symbol of decay, of a community on the brink of collapse. She dismounted, her hand resting on the butt of her colt. She scanned the area, her eyes searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The church was surrounded by overgrown weeds and crumbling tombstones, a silent testament to the passage of time, to the lives lost, to the dreams buried. She tied her horse to a weathered hitching post and walked towards the church, her boots crunching on the gravel path. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as she pushed them inward, revealing the dark, cavernous interior. The air inside was cold and damp, the scent of dust and decay filling her lungs. The only light came from the setting sun filtering through the cracked and stained glass windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The pews were broken and overturned, the altar covered in cobwebs, a scene of desolation and neglect. She waited, her senses on high alert. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the building and the distant murmur of voices from the town. Then she heard it. A soft footstep, a rustle of cloth, a shadow moving in the darkness. "You're alone, Sheriff?" A voice said, a low, gravelly voice that sent a chill down her spine. Clara turned, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and cold, cruel eyes. He was dressed in buckskins, a rifle slung over his shoulder, a pistol strapped to his hip. "Silas Blackwood." "I am," Clara said, her voice steady, despite the fear churning inside her. "You wanted to see me." He smiled, a chilling, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I did," he said. "I have a message for you. From the Johnsons." Clara's heart pounded. She knew this was it. The showdown. "They're not happy, Sheriff," Blackwood continued. "They don't like it when people interfere with their business." "Their business of killing innocent people?" Clara countered, her voice laced with anger. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Collateral damage, Sheriff," he said. "The price of progress." "Progress?" Clara scoffed. "You call this progress? Stirring up a war, selling guns to renegade tribes, you're a monster." His smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Watch your tongue, Sheriff," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You're in no position to make accusations." "I have proof," Clara said, her voice defiant. "A ledger, detailing all of your crimes." He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "A ledger?" he repeated. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb, Blackwood," Clara said. "Gideon Tate told me everything." His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition. "Tate," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "He's a dead man." "Not yet," Clara said. "And he's not the only one who knows the truth." Blackwood took a step closer, his hand moving towards his pistol. "You're bluffing, Sheriff," he said. "You have nothing." Clara held his gaze, her hand steady on her gun. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I have everything I need to bring you down." The tension stretched between them, thick and heavy. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, turning the church into a macabre theater. "Let's cut the charade, Sheriff," Blackwood growled. "The Johnsons want that ledger. And they want Tate. Dead or alive. Preferably dead." "They're not getting either," Clara said. "You have no choice," Blackwood sneered. "Play along and there won't have to be more bloodshed in this pathetic town." Before she could answer, The sound of approaching horses filled the air. She tensed, her grip tightening. Reinforcements? Or something else? She could hear whispers, shouts, and the jingle of spurs. The sounds of a busy, terrified town. A town that had heard the same rumors. They were coming for Gideon. They had overheard or been told of his capture and the possible link to the Johnsons. But what they didn't know was the scale, the depth of the depravity. The lynch mob was gathering, and their target was her prisoner, and the man she was starting once more to care for. She had to protect him. She had to stop them. She had a split second to make a decision. Trust Blackwood and hope he would honor his bargain? Or face the wrath of the mob and the Johnsons alone? The whispers were getting closer. The sun had almost completely set. Time was running out. She turned, her mind made up, when a gunshot rang out, followed by a scream of pain. Chapter 9. Ambush at Dawn. The gunshot echoed through the church, shattering the tense silence. Clara spun around, her Colt drawn, her eyes scanning the darkness. Blackwood was still standing there, a smirk on his face, his own gun still holstered. What was that? Clara demanded, her voice sharp. Sounds like your little problem just got solved, Sheriff, Blackwood said, his voice laced with amusement. Looks like the good people of Redemption decided to take justice into their own hands. Clara's blood ran cold. The lynch mob. They'd reached the jail. She couldn't finish the thought. She had to get back there. She had to protect Gideon. She holstered her gun, her mind racing. She couldn't fight Blackwood and the mob. She was outnumbered, outgunned. She needed a plan, and she needed one fast. You're not going anywhere, Sheriff, Blackwood said, blocking her path. We have a deal to make. The deal's off, Clara said, her voice firm. I'm not handing over Gideon to you, or the Johnsons. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. You think you have a choice?
He said.
You're surrounded, Sheriff. My men are outside. And the town, they're not on your side anymore. He was right. She was trapped. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let them win. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the church, searching for an escape route. There was a back door hidden behind the altar. It was a long shot, but it was her only chance. I'm not afraid of you, Blackwood, she said, her voice defiant. Or your men. She lunged forward, shoving him aside, and sprinted towards the back door. He roared in anger, his hand reaching for his gun, but she was faster. She burst through the door, her heart pounding, her lungs burning. She found herself in a small, overgrown graveyard, the tombstones casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. She ran, her boots crunching on the gravel, her eyes scanning the area. She could hear Blackwood's men shouting, their footsteps pursuing her. She reached the edge of the graveyard, her horse still tethered to the hitching post. She scrambled onto the saddle, her hands fumbling with the reins. She spurred the horse forward, galloping away from the church, away from Blackwood, away from the town. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. She had to find a way to save Gideon. She rode through the night, the wind whipping through her hair, the stars her only guide. She rode until her horse was exhausted, until she was miles away from Redemption. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, she found herself in a secluded canyon, a hidden oasis in the vast, unforgiving landscape. She dismounted, her legs stiff and aching, her body exhausted. She collapsed onto the ground, her back against a smooth rock, her mind racing. She was alone, hunted, with no one to turn to. But she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let them win. She had to find a way to get back to Redemption, to rescue Gideon, to expose the Johnsons and Blackwood. But how? She was one woman against an army. She closed her eyes, her head resting against the rock, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She needed to rest, to gather her strength, to come up with a plan. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard a sound. A soft, familiar sound. The whinny of a horse. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. She wasn't alone. She reached for her gun, her hand shaking. She scanned the canyon, her eyes searching for the source of the sound. Then she saw him. Riding towards her, silhouetted against the rising sun, was a figure on horseback. A tall, familiar figure.
Gideon.
He was alive. He'd escaped. Relief washed over her, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. But it was quickly followed by confusion. How had he escaped? Who had shot at the church? Was it a warning? A distraction? He dismounted, his eyes searching hers, concern etched on his face. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I thought they'd killed you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head. "They tried," he said.
"But someone helped me."
"Someone I didn't expect." He looked exhausted, battered, but alive. And he was here, with her. But who had helped him?
And why?
The ambush had been a failure, but it had also been a revelation. There were more players in this game than she'd realized. Hidden alliances, secret motives, a web of deceit that stretched far beyond redemption. And she and Gideon were caught in the middle. The sun was rising fully now, casting a golden glow over the canyon. A new day. A new set of challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. And together, maybe just maybe, they could win this fight. The sound of approaching horses, multiple this time, shattered the moment of fragile peace. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. They exchanged a look. This time it was not a question. It was a battle. They were ready. Chapter 10. Scars and Secrets. Gideon and Clara stood side by side, their backs against the canyon wall, their guns drawn. The approaching horses grew louder, closer, the sound echoing through the narrow passage. They were outnumbered, but not outmatched. They had the element of surprise, and they had each other. "Who do you think it is?" Clara asked, her voice low, her eyes scanning the canyon entrance. "Could be Blackwood's men," Gideon said, his voice grim. "Or the Johnsons. Or someone else entirely." He was right. They had made a lot of enemies in the past few days. It could be anyone. The riders appeared, a group of 5 men, heavily armed, their faces grim and determined. They weren't Blackwood's men, nor were they Johnson's cowboys. Clara didn't recognize them. "Hold it right there," Clara shouted, her voice firm, her Colt aimed at the lead rider. "State your business." The men reined in their horses, their eyes narrowed, their hands hovering near their weapons. The lead rider, a tall, lean man with a weathered face and a scar above his left eye, looked at Clara, then at Gideon. "We're looking for Gideon Tate," he said, his voice rough. "And the Sheriff of Redemption." "That's you, ain't it?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "What do you want?" she asked. The man dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked towards them, his hands held up in a gesture of peace, though his eyes held a hint of suspicion. "We heard about the trouble in Redemption," he said. "About the attack, the Johnsons, Blackwood, we heard Tate escaped." "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice wary. "Name's Caleb," the man said. "We're associates of Tate's. From a long time ago." Gideon lowered his gun slightly, his eyes narrowed in recognition. "Caleb?"
he said.
"Is that really you?" Caleb nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. "It is Gideon," he said. "It's been a long time." Clara looked at Gideon, her confusion evident. "You know these men?"
she asked.
Gideon nodded.
"They're from my past," he said.
Before I left." Clara's mind raced. These men were outlaws, like Gideon. They were part of the life he'd left behind, the life she'd tried to forget. "What do you want?" Clara asked again, her voice still wary. "We want to help," Caleb said. "We know about the Johnsons, about Blackwood. We know what they're doing. And we want to stop them." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. Outlaws, wanting to help a sheriff? It seemed impossible.
"Why?" she asked.
"Why would you help us?" Caleb looked at Gideon, then back at Clara. "Gideon saved our lives, once," he said. "Back when we were all riding together. We owe him a debt. And we don't like what the Johnsons are doing." We don't like bullies, and we don't like warmongers. Clara hesitated, her mind filled with doubt. Could she trust these men? They were outlaws, criminals. But they were also Gideon's friends, his former comrades. And they seemed genuinely determined to help. We need that ledger, Clara said. The one that proves the Johnsons' crimes. Caleb nodded. We know, he said. We can help you get it. They spent the next few hours discussing their plan, laying out their strategy. Caleb and his men knew the area, knew the Johnsons' movements, knew Blackwood's hideouts. They had information, resources, and manpower. As the sun began to set, they prepared to move. They were going to retrieve the ledger, and then they were going to expose the Johnsons and Blackwood, once and for all. Clara checked the loads and looked at Gideon. Ready? She asked, her heart racing. Gideon met her gaze, and for a moment, it was as though the years between had fallen away. He reached out his hand and brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. The simple contact made her breath hitch. It was more intimate than any kiss could have been. I've been waiting for this for a long time, Clara, Gideon said softly, holding her gaze. Too long. Clara nodded, understanding. He wasn't just talking about the Johnsons, he was talking about them, about the chance to clear his name. To clear their past. He stepped back, the moment passing, and turned to Caleb. Let's ride, he said. They rode out of the canyon, a small band of unlikely allies, united by a common goal, justice. They rode towards redemption, towards the Johnsons, towards Blackwood, towards a showdown that would determine the fate of the town and their own futures. They rode towards a reckoning. As they crested a small rise, Clara saw smoke rising in the distance, dark and ominous against the twilight sky. It was coming from the direction of town. Her heart clenched with fear. What had happened? Had they been too late? She spurred her horse forward, Gideon and the others close behind. They had to get there. They had to find out what was happening. They had to stop the bloodshed. But as they rode, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding into something far bigger, far more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. The scars of the past and the secrets they held were about to be revealed. And the price of truth, she feared, would be higher than ever. The smoke thickened as they rode, and the smell of burning would fill the air. Something was terribly wrong. Chapter 11. The Weight of the Law. The sight that greeted them as they rode into redemption was one of chaos and destruction. Buildings were ablaze, the flames licking at the night sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the scene. Gunshots echoed through the streets, punctuated by screams and shouts. The town was under attack. What happened? Clara shouted, her voice barely audible above the din. Blackwood, Gideon said, his voice grim. He must have retaliated. For the attack on the homesteads, for us going after the ledger. Clara's heart sank. She'd known this was a possibility, but she'd hoped they could prevent it. Now, the town was paying the price for her actions, for her pursuit of justice. We have to stop him, she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We have to protect the town. Caleb nodded. We're with you, Sheriff, he said. Let's do this. They rode into the heart of the chaos, their guns drawn, their eyes scanning the streets. They encountered pockets of resistance, townsfolk fighting back against Blackwood's men, but they were outmatched, outgunned. Clara saw familiar faces, people she'd sworn to protect, fighting for their lives. She saw Martha, her sturdy frame wielding a shotgun with surprising accuracy, holding off a group of outlaws. She saw the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the saloon owner, all fighting desperately to defend their homes, their town. Clara and her unlikely allies joined the fray, their guns blazing, their presence a beacon of hope in the midst of the despair. They fought their way through the streets, pushing back Blackwood's men, rescuing trapped civilians, trying to restore order to the chaos. Clara found herself face to face with Blackwood himself, his eyes filled with a cold, cruel fury. He was standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by his men, a sneer on his face. You can't stop me, Sheriff, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. This town is mine. It's not yours, Blackwood, Clara said, her voice firm, her Colt aimed at his heart. And you're going to pay for what you've done. He laughed, a chilling, mocking sound. You, and what army?
He said.
Before Clara could answer, a volley of gunfire erupted from behind Blackwood, his men falling to the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets. Clara looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. Standing on the rooftops, their rifles smoking, were a group of figures she hadn't expected to see. The homesteaders. The very people the Johnsons had been cheating, stealing from, oppressing. They'd armed themselves, they'd organized, and they'd come to fight. Blackwood turned, his eyes filled with disbelief, then rage. You traitors! He screamed. The homesteaders didn't answer. They simply continued to fire, their shots precise and deadly. Blackwood's men were caught in a crossfire, trapped between Clara's group and the homesteaders. The tide had turned. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, but slowly, surely, Blackwood's forces were decimated. The outlaws were either killed or captured, their reign of terror brought to an end. Finally, only Blackwood himself remained, standing alone in the middle of a street, his gun empty, his face a mask of defeat. Clara approached him, her Colt still trained on him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. It's over, Blackwood, she said, her voice weary. Surrender. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a hatred that was palpable. I'll never surrender, he said, his voice hoarse. I'll die before I let you take me. He reached for a hidden knife, his movements desperate, but Clara was faster. She fired, her shot hitting him in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. He lay there, his lifeblood staining the dusty street, his eyes staring up at the night sky, his reign of terror finally over. Clara lowered her gun, her hand shaking, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was over. Blackwood was dead. The town was safe, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been too high. Too many lives had been lost, too much damage had been done. She looked around at the devastation, at the burning buildings, at the wounded and the dead. The weight of her responsibility, the weight of the law, pressed down on her, almost crushing her. She had saved the town, but at what cost? Had she done the right thing? Had she made the right choices? She didn't know. She only knew that she was tired, weary to the bone, and that she needed to rebuild, to heal, to find a way to move forward. Gideon walked towards her, his eyes full of concern. He gently took the gun from her shaking hand and pulled her into a hug. It was the first time he had held her like this since before. And it felt right. It felt like coming home. She leaned into him, letting his strength support her, letting his warmth soothe her. It's all right, Clara, he whispered. It's over. You did it. She nodded, her face buried in his chest, her tears finally flowing. She cried for the lives lost, for the town that had been ravaged, for the innocence that had been shattered. She cried for the girl she used to be, and for the woman she had become. She cried for the weight of the badge, and the price of justice. But most of all, she cried with relief, because she knew, deep down, that despite everything, she had done the right thing. She had upheld the law, protected her town, and kept her promise. The weight was heavy, but she could bear it. She had to. For redemption.
For Gideon.
For herself. The fires were still burning, but they were starting to die down. The dawn was coming, and with it, a new beginning, a new chance to rebuild, a new hope for the future. But first she needed to rest. She needed to heal. She needed to find a way to live with the scars, both visible and invisible. The weight of the law was a heavy burden, but it was one she would carry. Always. She looked up at Gideon, her eyes red and swollen, but filled with a newfound strength.
What now?
She asked, her voice hoarse, but steady. He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. Now, he said, we rebuild. Chapter 12. A desperate ride. The aftermath of the battle was a scene of somber activity. The townsfolk, exhausted but resilient, worked together to extinguish the remaining fires, tend to the wounded, and clear the debris. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burnt wood, a constant reminder of the violence that had ravaged their town. Clara, despite her own exhaustion, moved among the people, offering comfort, assistance, and direction. She was the sheriff, their protector, their leader, and she wouldn't let them down. She checked in on Martha, who was nursing a wounded arm but otherwise unharmed, her spirit undaunted. She spoke to the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, the saloon owner, all of whom had fought bravely to defend their homes. She also kept a watchful eye on the captured outlaws, ensuring they were securely confined, awaiting transport to a more permanent prison. The Johnsons, their involvement in the gun-running scheme now exposed, were under house arrest, their power and influence shattered. But there was one person Clara couldn't find.
Gideon.
He'd been by her side throughout the battle, his presence a source of strength and comfort. But after Blackwood's death, after the fighting had stopped, he'd disappeared. She searched for him, her heart filled with a growing unease. Had he been injured? Had he been captured? Had he left again? She finally found him outside the town, near the edge of the desert, his horse saddled and ready to go. He was standing there, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the horizon.
Gideon?
She said, her voice hesitant, her heart pounding. He turned, his face etched with weariness, his eyes filled with a sadness she'd seen before. Clara, he said, his voice low and rough. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling, her fear evident. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze searching hers. I have to leave, he said. The words hit her like a physical blow, the pain sharp and unexpected. Leave? She repeated, her voice barely a whisper.
Why?
I'm still a wanted man, Clara, he said. I can't stay here. It's not safe. For me, or for you. But you helped us, she said, her voice pleading.
You saved the town.
You exposed the Johnsons. Blackwood, you're a hero. He shook his head, a sad smile on his lips.
I'm no hero, Clara, he said.
I'm just a man trying to do what's right. But you can stay, she insisted. I can clear your name. I can testify on your behalf. She couldn't finish the sentence, her voice choked with emotion. She was the sheriff. She had the power, the authority, to make it happen. But she also knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, opposition, legal hurdles. And there was still the matter of his past, the crimes he'd committed before he'd left. It's not that simple, Clara, he said, his voice gentle. There are complications. What complications? She demanded, her frustration rising.
Tell me.
Let me help you. He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. There are things you don't know, he said. Things about my past, things I'm not proud of. I don't care about your past, Gideon, she said, her voice firm. I care about you. I care about what you've done here, what you've risked. I care about us. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was the first time she'd acknowledged her feelings, the first time she'd admitted, to herself and to him, that she still cared, that she still loved him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something else. Hope. Longing? It was hard to tell. Clara, he began, his voice hesitant. But before he could finish, a shout interrupted them. Sheriff! Sheriff! It was one of the homesteaders, running towards them, his face pale and frantic. Sheriff, he repeated, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They've taken the ledger. The Johnsons' men, they found it. Clara's blood ran cold. The ledger. The proof. It was gone.
How?
She demanded, her voice sharp. They must have had a spy, the homesteader said. Someone who knew where it was hidden. They ambushed us. We didn't stand a chance. Clara's mind raced. A spy. Someone within their ranks, someone they'd trusted. But who? They're heading south, the homesteader continued. Towards the border. They're going to try to escape. Clara knew what she had to do. She had to get that ledger back. It was the only way to bring the Johnsons to justice, to ensure that their crimes wouldn't go unpunished. She turned to Gideon, her eyes pleading. I have to go after them, she said. I have to get that ledger back. He nodded, his eyes understanding. I know, he said. And I'm going with you. She shook her head.
No, she said.
It's too dangerous. You need to leave. You need to get away from here. I'm not leaving you, Clara, he said, his voice firm. Not this time. He stepped forward, taking her hand. His touch was warm, strong, reassuring. It was a promise.
A vow.
A desperate ride. We'll get that ledger back, he said. His eyes burned into hers, making her believe it. Making her believe in them again. Together. She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They mounted their horses, their eyes locked in a silent understanding. They were partners, allies, bound by a shared purpose, a shared past, a shared love. They spurred their horses forward, galloping towards the south, towards the border, towards a desperate chase. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, turning the sky into a canvas of fiery colors. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, a reflection of their own journey, a journey filled with danger, uncertainty, and the fragile hope of a second chance. A chance at justice, a chance at redemption, a chance at love. But first they had to survive. They had to retrieve that ledger. They had to outrun the Johnsons and whatever other forces were at play. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But they were ready to take it. Together. The wind whipped through their hair, the sound of their horses' hooves pounding against the hard earth. They were riding into the unknown, into the darkness. But they were not afraid. They had each other. And that was all that mattered.
For now.
Chapter 13. Hidden Truths. The chase was relentless, a grueling pursuit across the harsh, unforgiving landscape. Clara and Gideon rode for hours, pushing their horses to their limits, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock their efforts. They followed the tracks of the Johnsons' men, a clear trail leading them south, towards the border. They encountered dangers along the way, treacherous terrain, wild animals, the ever-present threat of ambush. But they persevered, their determination fueled by their shared purpose, their unspoken bond. As night fell, they found a small, secluded canyon, a temporary haven from the dangers of the open desert. They dismounted, their bodies aching, their horses exhausted. They built a small fire, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, providing a semblance of warmth and comfort. They ate a meager meal of dried meat and biscuits, their silence filled with unspoken thoughts, with worries and hopes. Who do you think the spy was? Clara asked, her voice breaking the silence, her gaze fixed on the flames. Gideon shrugged, his expression grim.
Could be anyone, he said.
Someone the Johnsons paid off, someone with a grudge, someone we trusted. The thought stung. They'd been betrayed, their trust violated. It made her question everyone, everything. We can't dwell on it now, Gideon said, his voice firm. We need to focus on getting that ledger back. He was right. They couldn't afford to be distracted by doubts and suspicions. They needed to stay focused, to stay alert. Do you think they'll reach the border? Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. They'll try, Gideon said. But it's still a long way. And we're not far behind. They lapsed into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire crackled, the wind whispered through the canyon. The stars shone brightly in the clear night sky. Clara looked at Gideon, his face illuminated by the firelight. He looked tired, weary, but also determined. A flicker of the boy she'd once loved shone through the hardened exterior. Gideon, she said, her voice soft. You said there were things I didn't know. About your past. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He hesitated, his gaze darting away, as if he were afraid of what she might see. It's not a pretty story, Clara, he said, his voice low and rough. I don't care, she said. I need to know. I need to understand. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the flames. After Sarah died, he began, his voice hesitant. I went a little crazy. I wanted revenge. I wanted to make the Johnsons pay. He paused, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching. I joined up with Caleb and his gang, he continued. We were outlaws. We robbed banks, trains, stagecoaches. We did things I'm not proud of. Clara listened, her heart aching for him. She knew he'd been through hell. that he'd been driven by grief and anger. But she also knew that he wasn't a bad man. He'd made mistakes, yes, but he'd also shown courage, loyalty, and a deep sense of justice. "But I never killed anyone," he said, his voice firm. "Not innocents. I always tried to minimize the damage. I always tried to do what was right, even when I was doing wrong." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I know it's not an excuse," he said, "but it's the truth." Clara reached out, her hand covering his. "I believe you, Gideon," she said, her voice sincere. "I know you're not a killer." He squeezed her hand, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Clara," he said, "for believing in me." They sat there for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their silence filled with a newfound understanding, a deeper connection. "There's something else," Gideon said, his voice hesitant. "Something about the Johnsons, something I learned after I left." Clara's heart pounded. Another secret. Another revelation. "What is it?" she asked, her voice urgent. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a darkness she hadn't seen before. "The Johnsons, they weren't just working with Blackwood," he said. "They were involved in something bigger. Something that goes all the way to the top." Clara's brow furrowed. "The top?" she repeated. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on hers. "They were connected to powerful men in the government," he said. "Politicians, officials, men who were profiting from the war, from the chaos. Men who were pulling the strings, manipulating events, men who were above the law." He paused, a shiver running down his spine, even in the relative safety of the fire's warmth. Men who would do anything to protect their interests. Clara's mind reeled. It was a conspiracy, a web of deceit that stretched far beyond redemption, far beyond the Johnsons and Blackwood. It reached into the very heart of the government, into the halls of power. "Who?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Who are these men?" Gideon shook his head. "I don't know their names," he said, "but I know they exist. And I know they're dangerous. They're the real enemy, Clara. The ones behind it all." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. They weren't just fighting the Johnsons and Blackwood. They were fighting a shadow war, a battle against a hidden enemy, an enemy that was powerful, ruthless, and seemingly untouchable. The fire had died down, the embers glowing red in the darkness. The night was cold, the silence heavy with the weight of their discovery. They were in deeper than they'd ever imagined. They were facing an enemy far more powerful than they'd realized. An enemy that could crush them without a second thought. But they couldn't back down.
Not now.
Not after everything they'd learned. They had to keep fighting. For justice. For redemption. For the future. They had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Even if it meant facing down the most powerful men in the country. Even if it meant risking their own lives. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were in this together. Until the end. The embers glowed, a faint flicker of hope in the vast darkness. A reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there was always a spark of light. A spark of hope. A spark of courage. A spark of love. And that spark, they knew, was enough to keep them going.
For now.
They settled down to rest, knowing the journey ahead would be even more dangerous than before. But they were ready.
Or at least they had to be.
Chapter 14. The Ties That Bind. The next morning, they set off again. Their determination renewed, their resolve strengthened by the shared secrets, the unspoken bond. They followed the tracks of the Johnsons' men, the trail leading them closer and closer to the border. As they rode, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that they were being watched, followed. The vast, open landscape, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a trap, a cage with invisible bars. "Gideon," she said, her voice low, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Do you think they know we're following them?" He nodded, his expression grim. "They probably do," he said. "They're not stupid. They know we're after that ledger." "But how could they know about the other stuff?" Clara asked, her voice filled with concern. "About the government connection?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the trail. "Maybe they don't," he said. "Or maybe they have their own sources. Maybe they're being warned. The thought was chilling. It meant that their every move was being monitored, that their chances of success were dwindling with each passing hour. They rode in silence for a while, the tension thick between them. The sun beat down on them, the heat relentless, the landscape unforgiving. Suddenly, Gideon reined in his horse, his eyes narrowed, his hand raised in a signal to stop. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice urgent. He pointed towards a ridge in the distance, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the trail. "Ambush," he said, his voice low and grim. "They're waiting for us." Clara's heart pounded. She could see them now, figures moving among the rocks, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. They were outnumbered, outgunned, trapped in the open. "We need to find cover," she said, her voice firm, her mind racing. They spurred their horses forward, galloping towards a small cluster of boulders at the base of the ridge. They dismounted, their movements quick and efficient, their guns drawn. The gunfire erupted, a hail of bullets whizzing past them, kicking up dust and splintering rock. They returned fire, their shots precise and deadly, but they were pinned down, their position precarious. "We can't stay here," Gideon said, his voice urgent. "They'll surround us." He was right. They needed to move, to find a better position, a way to escape. "There's a canyon," Clara said, pointing towards a narrow opening in the ridge. "A few miles back. We could try to reach it." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was their only chance. They made a run for it, sprinting across the open ground, bullets flying around them, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached their horses, scrambled onto the saddles, and spurred them forward, galloping back the way they'd come. The Johnsons' men pursued them, their horses thundering behind them, their shots echoing through the desert. It was a chase, a race against time, a fight for survival. Clara and Gideon rode like the wind, their horses flying across the rugged terrain, their bodies low in the saddles, their eyes fixed on the canyon entrance. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers, the pounding of hooves, the relentless gunfire. They reached the canyon, a narrow, winding passage that offered a semblance of cover. They rode through it, their horses navigating the treacherous path, their guns at the ready. But the Johnsons' men were closing in, their numbers overwhelming. They were trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a familiar voice. "Gideon, Clara, over here." It was Caleb, standing on a ledge overlooking the canyon, his rifle raised. His men were with him, positioned along the canyon walls, their guns aimed at the pursuing outlaws. They opened fire, a volley of shots that rained down on the Johnsons' men, catching them by surprise, scattering their ranks. Clara and Gideon reined in their horses, their eyes wide with disbelief. Caleb and his gang had found them. They'd come to their rescue. "What are you doing here?" Gideon shouted, his voice filled with surprise. "We figured you might need some help," Caleb shouted back, a grin on his face. "We've been tracking you, keeping an eye out." The tide had turned. The ambushers had become the ambushed. The Johnsons' men were caught in a crossfire, trapped between Clara and Gideon and Caleb's gang. The outlaws were routed, killed, captured, or sent fleeing back the way they had come. Clara and Gideon dismounted, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. They approached Caleb, their gratitude evident. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice sincere. "You saved our lives." Caleb nodded, his expression serious. "We owe Gideon," he said. "And we don't like what the Johnsons are doing. We're in this together." The ties that bound them, the bonds of loyalty, friendship, and shared purpose, had proven stronger than the forces arrayed against them. They were a team, a band of unlikely allies, united by a common goal: justice. But as they gathered to regroup and replan, a rider appeared on the horizon. One rider, carrying a white flag. A messenger. Clara felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The messenger approached, his face grim, his eyes avoiding Clara's. He held out a sealed letter. "For the Sheriff of Redemption," he said, his voice shaking. From the governor. Clara's hand trembled as she took the letter. The ties that bind, she thought, could also strangle. She had a sinking feeling that the hidden enemy was about to reveal themselves, and the price of truth was about to get a whole lot steeper. She looked at Gideon, a silent question in her eyes. He nodded, his jaw set, his hand resting on his gun. They were ready. Or, at least, they hoped they were. She broke the seal and began to read. Chapter 15. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Clara unfolded the letter, her hands trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. The governor's seal, a symbol of authority and power, stared back at her, a silent accusation. She began to read, her eyes scanning the elegant script, the words blurring before her. The letter was short, concise, and devastating. It ordered her immediate suspension from her duties as sheriff, citing allegations of misconduct, insubordination, and consorting with known criminals. It demanded that she surrender her badge and her weapons, and that she present herself before a special tribunal in the state capital to answer the charges against her. It was signed by Governor Milton, a man she'd once respected, a man she believed to be a champion of justice. Clara's world crumbled around her. She'd been betrayed, her trust shattered, her career, her reputation, her life all ruined. She looked up, her eyes meeting Gideon's, her expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and despair. "They know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They know everything." Gideon took the letter, his eyes scanning the words, his face hardening with anger. "It's a setup," he said, his voice grim. "The Johnsons, the government officials, they're covering their tracks. They're silencing you." Clara felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She'd been so close to exposing them, to bringing them to justice. But they'd outmaneuvered her. They'd used their power and influence to crush her. Caleb and his men gathered around, their faces filled with concern and anger. They'd witnessed the betrayal, the injustice, and they were ready to fight. "What are you going to do, Sheriff?" Caleb asked, his voice firm. "Are you going to obey this order?" Clara shook her head, her resolve hardening, her despair giving way to a burning anger. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let them win. I won't let them silence me." She crumpled the letter in her hand, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm still the sheriff of redemption," she said. "And I have a duty to protect my town, to uphold the law, to bring the guilty to justice." She looked at Gideon, her eyes pleading for his support. "Will you stand with me?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers, his hand reaching for hers. "Always, Clara," he said. "I'm with you, no matter what." Their hands clasped together, a symbol of their unity, their determination, their love. They were in this together, facing a powerful, ruthless enemy, an enemy that had infiltrated the highest levels of government. "We need to get that ledger," Clara said, her voice urgent. "It's the only proof we have. It's the only way to expose them." Caleb nodded. "We know where the Johnsons' men were heading," he said. "We can track them, find them." They mounted their horses, their faces grim, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They were riding into a storm, a battle against a seemingly insurmountable foe. But they were not alone. They had each other, they had Caleb and his men, and they had the truth on their side. They rode through the night, the stars their only guide, the wind their only companion. They rode towards an uncertain future, a future filled with danger, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of death. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, they reached a small, isolated settlement, a cluster of buildings near the border. It was a haven for outlaws, smugglers, and those seeking to escape the reach of the law. "This is it," Gideon said, his voice low. "This is where they'll be, trying to cross the border, to disappear." They dismounted, their movements cautious, their guns at the ready. They approached the settlement, their eyes scanning the buildings, the streets, the faces of the inhabitants. They found them in a small, dingy saloon, a group of men huddled around a table, their faces tense, their eyes darting nervously towards the door. They were the Johnsons' men, the ones who had stolen the ledger. Clara and Gideon burst into the saloon, their guns drawn, their presence commanding. The men at the table jumped to their feet, their hands reaching for their weapons, their faces filled with fear and surprise. "It's over," Clara said, her voice firm, her Colt aimed at the leader of the group. "Hand over the ledger." The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape route. But there was none. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. He slowly reached into his saddlebag, his hand trembling. He pulled out a leather-bound book, its pages filled with handwritten entries, the evidence of the Johnsons' crimes. He tossed the ledger onto the table, his face a mask of defeat. "Take it," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's yours." Clara picked up the ledger, her heart pounding with relief. They had it. They had the proof. They could finally expose the Johnsons, the corrupt officials, the entire conspiracy. But as she held the ledger in her hands, she felt a sudden chill, a premonition of danger. She looked up, her eyes meeting Gideon's, her expression filled with alarm. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice low. "It was too easy." He nodded, his eyes scanning the room, his hand tightening on his gun. "I know," he said. "I feel it too." Suddenly, the door burst open again, and a group of men stormed into the saloon, their guns blazing. They weren't Blackwood's men, nor were they the Johnsons. They were wearing the uniforms of the United States Cavalry, led by a stern-faced officer, with cold, calculating eyes. Clara's blood ran cold. The governor. He had sent the army after them. The betrayal was complete. The bitter sting of it was almost unbearable. She had trusted the wrong people, and now, she and Gideon were trapped, surrounded by soldiers, with nowhere to run. The ledger, the proof, felt heavy in her hand, a useless weight. The officer stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Clara, Gideon, Caleb, and their men. "Clara Monroe," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest." His eyes flickered to Gideon. "Gideon Tate," he added. "Your time has run out." Chapter 16. Crossroads of the Heart. The saloon fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the heavy breathing of the men facing each other, their fates hanging in the balance. Clara stood defiant, her hand still clutching the ledger, her eyes locked on the cavalry officer. "On what charges?" she demanded, her voice firm, despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. The officer smiled, a cold, cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Treason, sedition, conspiracy, take your pick, Sheriff," he said. "You've interfered with matters of national security. You've aided and abetted known criminals. You've defied the authority of the governor." Clara's heart pounded. They were twisting the truth, turning her actions into crimes, painting her as a traitor. They were using the full force of the government against her, against them. "It's a lie," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "We've uncovered a conspiracy, a network of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of government. We have proof." She held up the ledger, her hand trembling. "This is the evidence," she said. "The Johnsons, Blackwood, the gun running, the war, it's all here." The officer didn't even glance at the ledger. "That book is irrelevant, Sheriff," he said. "It's nothing but a collection of fabricated lies designed to destabilize the region, to undermine the authority of the United States government." He turned to his men, his voice rising. "Seize them," he ordered, "and confiscate that so-called evidence." The soldiers moved forward, their rifles leveled at Clara, Gideon, Caleb, and their men. They were surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned. There was no escape. Clara looked at Gideon, her eyes filled with despair, with regret, with a love she'd only just begun to acknowledge. She'd led them into this. She'd put them all in danger. "I'm sorry, Gideon," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I failed." He shook his head, his eyes meeting hers, his hand reaching for hers. "You didn't fail, Clara," he said. "You did what was right. You fought for justice. You never gave up." He squeezed her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "And we're not giving up now," he said. "We'll find a way. We always do." His words gave her strength, a renewed sense of hope, a determination to keep fighting, even against impossible odds. But as the soldiers closed in, Clara knew that this might be the end. They were trapped, cornered, with nowhere to run. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a voice filled with authority and defiance. "Hold it right there." Everyone turned, their eyes widening in surprise. Standing in the doorway of the saloon, her figure silhouetted against the morning light, was Martha. She was holding a shotgun, her aim steady, her expression fierce. Behind her stood a group of townsfolk, armed with rifles, pistols, pitchforks, anything they could find. They were the people of redemption, the people Clara had sworn to protect, the people she'd fought for. They'd come to her rescue. "Let them go," Martha said, her voice booming through the saloon. "They're not criminals. They're heroes." The cavalry officer looked at Martha, then at the townsfolk, his expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. He hadn't expected this show of resistance, this defiance of his authority. "Stand down, old woman," he said, his voice condescending. "This is a matter for the United States Army. It doesn't concern you." "It concerns us all," Martha said, her voice firm. "These people are our friends, our neighbors, our protectors. They've fought for us, they've saved us. And we won't let you take them." The townsfolk murmured their agreement, their weapons raised, their faces determined. They were a ragtag group, farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people. But they were united, they were resolute, and they were ready to fight. The cavalry officer hesitated, his eyes assessing the situation. He was outnumbered, his men facing a determined and angry mob. He could order them to fire, to crush the resistance, but it would be a bloodbath, a massacre. And it would be witnessed by everyone in the town, potentially sparking a wider rebellion. He made a decision. "Stand down," he ordered his men, his voice tight with frustration. "We'll withdraw.
For now."
He turned to Clara, his eyes filled with a cold fury. "This isn't over, Sheriff," he said. "You may have won this battle, but you'll lose the war. The governor will not forget this.
And neither will I."
He turned and stalked out of the saloon, his men following him, their faces grim. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a stunned and silent crowd. Clara lowered her gun, her hand shaking, her body trembling with relief. They'd survived. They'd won.
For now.
She looked at Martha, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." Martha smiled, a warm, reassuring smile. "We saved each other, Clara," she said. "That's what we do in redemption. We stand together." The townsfolk cheered, their voices filled with relief and pride. They'd faced down the army. They defended their own. They'd shown their courage and their loyalty. Clara looked at Gideon, her heart filled with a mixture of love, gratitude, and a renewed sense of hope. They'd survived this crisis, but the war was far from over. They were at a crossroads. They could run, try to disappear, to escape the reach of the corrupt government. Or they could stay, fight, expose the truth, and face the consequences. It was a choice, a decision that would determine their future, their fate. A choice between love and duty, between freedom and justice. A choice between running and fighting. She looked into his eyes, searching for an answer, for guidance, for a sign. He knew what she was asking. He knew the risks, the dangers, the potential cost. He smiled, a gentle, loving smile that reached his eyes. "What do you want to do, Clara?" he asked softly. "It's your call." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. She knew what was right. She knew what her heart was telling her. She looked at the townsfolk, at Martha, at Gideon, at the people who had trusted her, who had stood by her, who had believed in her. She was the sheriff of redemption. And she would not run. She would not hide. She would fight.
For her town. For her people.
For justice. For love. She raised her head, her eyes filled with a newfound determination, a fierce resolve. "We stay," she said, her voice firm and clear. "We fight." The crossroads had been reached, and the path she had chosen was clear. It would be a difficult, dangerous path, But she would not walk it alone.
She had Gideon.
She had Martha. She had the people of redemption. And she had the truth. That she knew was enough.
For now.
The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the town. A new day. A new battle. A new hope. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. She was ready. Chapter 17. Under a sky of judgment. The decision made, the path chosen, Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, a renewed sense of purpose. She was the sheriff of redemption, and she would not abandon her town, her people, her duty. She would fight, even against the overwhelming power of the corrupt government. She gathered the townsfolk, Gideon, Caleb, and his men, in the center of the settlement, the dusty street their impromptu meeting place. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows, illuminating their faces, their determination, their fear. "We have a choice to make," Clara said, her voice firm and clear, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. "We can run, try to escape, to disappear. Or we can stay, fight, expose the truth, and face the consequences." She paused, letting her words sink in, letting them weigh the options, the risks, the potential rewards. "I've made my decision," she continued.
"I'm staying.
"I'm fighting. I'm the sheriff of redemption, and I won't abandon my duty, my people, my town." She looked at Gideon, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Gideon has chosen to stand with me," she said. "And I'm grateful for his courage, his loyalty, his love." She turned to Caleb and his men. "You've risked your lives for us," she said. "You've shown us friendship, loyalty, a shared sense of justice. I'm asking you to stand with us, to fight alongside us." Caleb nodded, his expression grim. "We're with you, Sheriff," he said. "We're not running. We're fighting." His men murmured their agreement, their faces determined, their weapons at the ready. Finally, Clara turned to the townsfolk, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "I know this is a dangerous path," she said. "I know it will be difficult, that we may face overwhelming odds. But I believe in us. I believe in redemption. I believe in justice." She paused, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm asking you to stand with me," she said. "To fight for your homes, your families, your freedom. To fight for the truth." For a moment, there was silence, a tense, expectant silence. Then, one by one, the townsfolk began to speak, their voices filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm with you, Sheriff," said Martha, her voice firm, her shotgun held high. "We'll fight," said the blacksmith, his strong hands gripping a hammer. "We won't let them win," said the shopkeeper, his eyes blazing with defiance. The others echoed their sentiments, their voices rising in a chorus of unity, of courage, of defiance. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people. But they were united, they were resolute, and they were ready to fight. Clara's heart swelled with pride, with gratitude, with a renewed sense of hope. She was not alone. She had her people. She had Gideon, she had Caleb and his men. And she had the truth. "We need a plan," she said, her voice firm, her mind racing. "We need to prepare, to organize, to defend ourselves." They spent the rest of the day fortifying the settlement, preparing for the inevitable attack. They barricaded the streets, set up defensive positions, organized patrols, and gathered supplies. They were a small force, facing a powerful enemy, but they were determined, they were resourceful, and they were united. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, they gathered in the center of the settlement, their faces grim, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They knew the attack was coming. They knew they were facing overwhelming odds, but they were ready. Clara stood before them, her badge shining brightly on her chest, her Colt strapped to her hip, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We may be outnumbered," she said, her voice echoing through the settlement. "We may be outgunned, but we are not outmatched. We have something they don't have. We have the truth. We have justice on our side. And we have each other." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd, her voice filled with emotion. "We are the people of redemption," she said. "And we will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced. We will not surrender. We will fight. For our homes, for our families, for our freedom. For justice. For a better future." Her words were met with a roar of approval, a chorus of defiance, a testament to their courage, their unity, their determination. They were ready. They would fight. They would not back down. As darkness fell, they waited, their senses on high alert, their weapons at the ready. The silence was broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, the beating of their own hearts. They were under a sky of judgment, a vast, star-studded expanse that seemed to watch over them, to witness their struggle, to weigh their fate. Suddenly, a signal flare shot into the sky, a bright, fiery arc that illuminated the horizon, a sign that the enemy was approaching. The attack had begun. Clara raised her Colt, her hand steady, her eyes focused, her heart pounding. "For redemption," she shouted, her voice echoing through the night. The battle was joined. The sky was their judge, their courage their weapon, and the truth their shield. They were ready to face whatever came, together. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air, a symphony of chaos and violence. But amidst the chaos, there was unity. Amidst the violence, there was courage. Amidst the darkness, there was hope. The hope for a better future. The hope for justice. The hope for redemption. The battle had begun, and the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The people of redemption would fight.
To the very end.
Under a sky of judgment, they would make their stand. Together. Chapter 18. A showdown of wills. The battle raged through the night, a fierce and brutal struggle between the defenders of redemption and the forces of the corrupt government, represented by the cavalry detachment. Gunfire echoed through the settlement, bullets whizzing through the air, explosions rocking the ground. Clara fought alongside her people, her Colt blazing, her movements precise and deadly. She was a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. She moved from position to position, rallying her forces, encouraging them, fighting alongside them. Gideon was by her side, his own gun blazing, his presence a source of strength and comfort. He fought with a fierce determination, his skills honed by years of living on the edge, his loyalty to Clara unwavering. Caleb and his men fought bravely, their outlaw skills proving invaluable in the close-quarters combat. They were a formidable force, their experience and ruthlessness a match for the disciplined soldiers of the cavalry. Martha and the townsfolk fought with a courage born of desperation, defending their homes, their families, their freedom. They were farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, ordinary people. But they were fighting for their lives, for their future, and they would not back down. The battle ebbed and flowed, the advantage shifting back and forth. The defenders of redemption, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a fierce determination, their knowledge of the terrain and their unity giving them an edge. The cavalry, though disciplined and well-equipped, were hampered by their unfamiliarity with the settlement and the unexpected ferocity of the resistance. They had expected an easy victory, a swift and decisive crushing of the rebellion. But they had underestimated the people of redemption, their courage, their determination, their unity. As the night wore on, the casualties mounted on both sides. The streets of the settlement were littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded, a grim testament to the brutality of the conflict. Clara found herself face to face with a cavalry officer, the man who had ordered her arrest, the man who represented the corrupt government she was fighting against. They stood in the center of the street, their guns drawn, their eyes locked in a deadly stare. The battle raged around them, but they were oblivious to it, their focus solely on each other. "It's over, Sheriff," the officer said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Surrender. And maybe, just maybe, some of your people will live." "It's never over," Clara said, her voice firm, her hand steady on her Colt. "Not until justice is served." Not until the truth is revealed. The truth? The officer scoffed. You're delusional, Sheriff. You're fighting a losing battle. You're fighting against the inevitable. Maybe, Clara said. But I'm not fighting alone. I have my people. I have the truth. And I have my convictions. They stared at each other, their wills clashing, their destinies intertwined. It was a showdown, a battle not just of guns, but of ideals, of beliefs, of wills. The officer raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Clara did the same, her heart pounding, her mind racing. But before either of them could fire, a shot rang out, a single, precise shot that echoed through the night. The officer staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand clutching at his chest. He looked down, his face a mask of disbelief, as a crimson stain spread across his uniform. He collapsed to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring up at the sky, his reign of terror finally over. Clara lowered her gun, her hand shaking, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She hadn't fired the shot. She looked around, her eyes searching for the source of the shot, for the person who had saved her life. She saw him then, standing on a rooftop, his rifle still smoking, his face grim.
Gideon.
He'd saved her. Again. He lowered his rifle, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the moment, of the bond between them, of the shared victory. The shot that killed the officer seemed to break the spirit of the remaining cavalry soldiers. They began to retreat, their formation breaking, their discipline crumbling. They had lost their leader. They had lost their will to fight. The defenders of redemption, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed their advantage, their gunfire intensifying, their shouts of defiance echoing through the settlement. The cavalry retreated in disarray, leaving behind their dead and wounded, their hopes of crushing the rebellion shattered. The battle was over. Redemption had won. Clara stood in the center of the street, her body exhausted, her mind reeling, her heart filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a profound sadness. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The corrupt government, the powerful men pulling the strings, they were still out there. And they would not forget this defeat. They would retaliate. They would seek revenge. But for now, redemption was safe. The town had been defended, the people had survived, the truth had been preserved. It was a victory, a hard-fought, bloody victory, but a victory nonetheless. She looked up at the sky, the first rays of dawn beginning to paint the horizon. A new day, a new beginning, a new hope, but also a new set of challenges. She knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had Gideon. She had Martha. She had Caleb and his men. She had the people of redemption. And she had the truth. That she knew was enough to keep fighting.
To keep hoping.
To keep believing. In justice. In redemption. In love. The showdown of wills had ended. And Clara, the sheriff of redemption, had prevailed. But the war was just beginning. And she was ready. She had to be. Chapter 19. The Cost of Redemption. The dawn broke over redemption, casting a golden glow over the battered settlement, illuminating the aftermath of the battle. The streets were scarred, the buildings damaged, the air thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. But the spirit of the town was unbroken, the people resilient, their determination unwavering. They tended to the wounded, buried the dead, and began the arduous task of rebuilding their homes, their lives, their community. They had faced a powerful enemy, they had endured a brutal attack, but they had survived. They had won. Clara, despite her own exhaustion, moved among the people, offering comfort, assistance, and direction. She was their leader, their protector, their sheriff, and she would not let them down. She oversaw the care of the injured, the distribution of supplies, the organization of the rebuilding efforts. Gideon was by her side, his presence a constant source of strength and support. He helped with the heavy lifting, the clearing of debris, the comforting of the grieving. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a valued member of the community, a hero in the eyes of the townsfolk. Caleb and his men, their outlaw past now seemingly forgiven, worked alongside the people of redemption, their skills and experience proving invaluable in the rebuilding efforts. They had found a new purpose, a new loyalty, a new home. Martha, her arm in a sling, her spirit undaunted, was everywhere, organizing, directing, comforting, her voice a beacon of hope and resilience. But amidst the relief and the gratitude, there was a sense of unease, a knowledge that the victory was fragile, that the war was far from over. The corrupt government, the powerful men pulling the strings, they would not forget this defeat. They would retaliate, they would seek revenge. Clara knew that they needed to prepare, to strengthen their defenses, to find a way to expose the truth to the wider world, to bring the guilty to justice. She gathered Gideon, Caleb, Martha, and a few trusted representatives of the townsfolk in the battered remains of the sheriff's office, the walls scarred by bullets, the windows shattered, a stark reminder of the battle they had fought. "We've won this battle," Clara said, her voice firm, her eyes scanning the faces of those gathered around her. "But the war is far from over. They will come back. They will try to crush us." She paused, her gaze settling on the ledger, still clutched in her hand, the evidence of the conspiracy, the proof of the corruption. "We need to get this ledger to someone who can expose the truth," she said. "Someone who can bring these criminals to justice. Someone who is beyond their reach." They discussed various options, weighing the risks and benefits of each. They considered sending a messenger to a neighboring town, to a larger newspaper, to a sympathetic judge. But each option seemed fraught with danger, with the possibility of interception, betrayal, failure. Finally, Gideon spoke, his voice thoughtful, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "There's one person," he said. "Someone I used to know, someone I trust. He's a journalist, a writer, working for a newspaper in San Francisco. He's fearless, he's honest, and he's always looking for a good story." He paused, his gaze meeting Clara's. "He's also my brother." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't known Gideon had a brother, let alone one who was a journalist. It was a revelation, a potential solution, a glimmer of hope. "Can you reach him?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Gideon nodded. "I can try," he said. "But it's a long way to San Francisco. And it's dangerous. They'll be watching for us, for anyone trying to leave redemption." It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to get the truth out, to expose the conspiracy to the world. But it was their best chance, perhaps their only chance. They decided that Gideon and Caleb, with their outlaw skills and experience, would make the journey, carrying the ledger, evading the authorities, reaching San Francisco, and delivering the evidence to Gideon's brother. It was a perilous undertaking, a journey fraught with danger, uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of capture or death. But they were willing to risk it for the sake of redemption, for the sake of justice, for the sake of the future. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Gideon and Caleb prepared to leave. They gathered their supplies, checked their weapons, and said their farewells. Clara stood before Gideon, her heart filled with a mixture of love, fear, and a profound sadness. She knew this might be the last time she saw him, that he might not return. "Be careful, Gideon," she said, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers, his hand reaching for hers. "I will," he said. "I promise." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender, passionate kiss that spoke of their love, their bond, their shared hope. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, their commitment, their love. "I'll come back, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise. We'll finish this. Together." He released her, his gaze lingering on hers for a moment longer, before turning and mounting his horse. Caleb joined him, and together, they rode off into the sunset, two figures silhouetted against the fiery sky, their destination unknown, their fate uncertain. Clara watched them go, her heart aching, her tears flowing freely. She didn't know if she would ever see Gideon again, if he would survive the journey, if they would ever be reunited. But she had hope. She had faith. She had the belief that justice would prevail, that the truth would be revealed, that love would conquer all. The cost of redemption was high, very high. Separation, uncertainty, fear. But she was willing to pay the price. For Gideon. For redemption. For the future. She stood there, alone under the vast, star-studded sky, watching as the figures of Gideon and Caleb disappeared into the distance. She was the sheriff of redemption. And she would wait. She would hope. She would believe. And she would continue to fight. Until the very end. The sun had set, and the darkness had fallen. But in her heart, there was a flicker of light. A spark of hope. A promise of redemption. And that, she knew, was enough.
For now.
She turned and walked back towards the town, towards her people, towards her duty. The cost was high, but the reward, she knew, would be even greater. Justice. Truth.
Love.
Redemption. It was all worth fighting for. And she would not give up. Not ever. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed. The desert bloomed and withered. Redemption slowly rebuilt, the scars of the battle fading, the spirit of the town renewed. Clara remained steadfast, her duties as sheriff unwavering, her hope for Gideon's return a constant flame in her heart. She received no word from him, no message, no sign. The silence was deafening, the uncertainty agonizing. But she refused to give up hope. She believed in him, in his courage, in his love. She continued to fight for justice, working tirelessly to expose the conspiracy, to bring the guilty to power. She gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and sent letters to anyone she thought might be able to help, to newspapers, to judges, to politicians, anyone who might be willing to listen. But her efforts were met with resistance, with silence, with veiled threats. The corrupt government, the powerful men pulling the strings, they were still in control, their influence pervasive, their reach long. Then, one day, a rider arrived in redemption, a stranger, dusty and weary, carrying a message from San Francisco. Clara's heart pounded as she took the letter, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. It was from Gideon's brother, the journalist. He had received the ledger. He had read the evidence. He had believed. And he had acted. He had published the story, a series of articles exposing the conspiracy, naming names, revealing the corruption, shaking the foundations of the government. The response was immediate, explosive, and far-reaching. The public was outraged. The media was in a frenzy. The politicians were scrambling to cover their tracks. Investigations were launched. Arrests were made. Trials were held. The Johnsons were brought to justice, their crimes exposed, their power broken. The corrupt officials, the men who had profited from the war, the men who had manipulated events, they were exposed, disgraced, and imprisoned. The truth had been revealed. Justice had prevailed. But there was still no word from Gideon. Clara waited, her heart aching, her hope dwindling. Had he survived the journey? Had he been captured? She refused to think the worst. She clung to the belief that he was alive, that he would return. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, she saw him. Riding towards her, silhouetted against the fiery sky, was a familiar figure.
Gideon.
He was alive. He had returned. She ran towards him, her heart soaring, her tears flowing freely. He dismounted, his eyes meeting hers, his arms reaching for her. They embraced, a long, tender, passionate embrace that spoke of their love, their reunion, their victory. "I told you I'd come back," he said, his voice rough with emotion, his eyes filled with love. "I never doubted you," she said, her voice choked with tears, her heart overflowing with joy. They stood there, in the middle of the dusty street, the setting sun casting a golden glow around them, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to their courage, their resilience, their unwavering belief in each other. The final confrontation had been fought, not with guns, but with words, with truth, with the courage of those who dared to speak out against injustice. The hearts that had been tested, separated, and wounded were now reunited, healed, and stronger than ever. The horizons that had seemed so distant, so uncertain, were now clear, bright, and filled with promise. They had won. They had survived. They had found their redemption. Gideon took her hand, their fingers interlacing, their bond unbreakable. "What now, Clara?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes filled with love. She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "Now," she said, "we rebuild. We live. We love." They turned and walked towards the town, towards their home, towards their future. The sun had set, but the sky was filled with stars, a million points of light that shone down on them, a blessing, a promise, a testament to their enduring love. They walked hand in hand, into the heart of a redeemed town, and the wide open space of a future yet unwritten. Their final confrontation had brought them here, to this moment. And it was everything they had hoped for, everything they had fought for. They were home, together, and that, they knew, was all that mattered. The final confrontation had been a victory, not just of justice, but of love. And their love story, set against the backdrop of the wild, untamed West, would be told for generations to come. A story of courage, of resilience, of redemption. A story of a sheriff, an outlaw, and a town that refused to give up. A story, above all, of love. Their journey was done. Their story was told. And all that was left was the horizon. The beautiful, endless horizon, which they would face hand in hand, together. Always. Epilogue. Years passed. Redemption flourished, a testament to the courage and resilience of its people, a beacon of justice and hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. The scars of the past faded, replaced by new growth, new life, new beginnings. Clara remained the sheriff, her badge a symbol of her unwavering commitment to law and order, her presence a constant reassurance to the townsfolk. She was respected, admired, loved, a legend in her own time. Gideon, his name cleared, his past forgiven, stood by her side, his love a constant source of strength and support. He became a rancher, his hands working the land, his heart rooted in the community. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a pillar of redemption, a respected and valued member of the town. Martha, her arm healed, her spirit undimmed, continued to be the heart of the sheriff's office, her voice a constant presence, her wisdom a guiding light. Caleb and his men, their outlaw days behind them, found new lives, new purposes in redemption. They became ranchers, farmers, shopkeepers, contributing to the growth and prosperity of the town. They had found redemption, a second chance, a place to call home. The story of redemption, of the sheriff and the outlaw, of the battle against corruption, of the triumph of justice, became a legend, passed down through generations, a tale told around campfires, in saloons, in homes, a reminder of the courage, the resilience, the unwavering spirit of those who had fought for what was right. Clara and Gideon, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable, built a life together, a family, a legacy. They had children, grandchildren, who grew up hearing the stories of their parents, of their grandparents, of the town that had been saved, of the love that had conquered all. They lived long and fulfilling lives, their names etched in the history of redemption, their love story a testament to the power of hope, of faith, of the human spirit. And as the years passed and the sun set on their lives, they knew that they had made a difference, that they had left a mark on the world, that they had found their redemption. They would sit on their porch, in the quiet evenings, watching the sun set over the vast, beautiful landscape, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude, with love, with peace. They had faced the darkness, they had fought the battles, they had overcome the odds. And they had won. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the real world, in the harsh, unforgiving, beautiful reality of the Wild West. Their love story, a testament to their courage, their resilience, their unwavering belief in each other, would live on, a legend whispered on the wind, a beacon of hope in the vastness of the desert. The Sheriff and the Outlaw. A love story for the ages. A story of redemption. A story of hope. A story of love. And the story would continue, even after they were gone, carried on by the wind, the sun, and the stars. A timeless tale of courage and love under a vast and endless sky. Their legacy, their love, their redemption. It was complete. It was perfect. It was theirs. Forever. The sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. A beautiful ending. A beautiful beginning. A beautiful forever. And that was their story.